Welcome to FolkFear, where legends do not fade, they ferment. Here we do not chase ghosts, we listen to them. In the dim corners of forgotten villages, beneath the floorboards of ancestral homes, in the stitched hems of mourning veils and prayer flags fluttering in windless rooms, you'll find whispers, stories passed down not by voice, but by blood, by thread, by the things no one dares write down. These are not tales meant to frighten. They are warnings, rituals. In every episode, you'll hear a story that sounds like a lullaby at first, until you realize it's been sung to keep something asleep. Tonight's story is no different. It begins with a thread. Not just any thread, but the crimson thread, the one that binds fates, seals promises, and stains those who break them. So light a candle, close every window, and whatever you do, don't pull on the thread. This is the Crimson Thread, a haunting folk horror tale. The village of Taimla was the kind of place that forgot the world, and in turn had been forgotten by it. It sat curled at the edge of the forest like a child too afraid to wander far from its mother's arms. The trees there leaned in as if they knew secrets they could never say aloud, and the mist that crept along the narrow paths always seemed older than the stones beneath it. It was on the morning of her wedding that Lien discovered the red thread. Not around her wrist, as the elders told in their embroidered bedtime tales, not floating through the wind like a strand of fate drifting toward its destined twin, but beneath her fingernail. It throbbed softly, like a tiny heartbeat just under the skin, a crimson thread, impossibly fine, impossibly long, coiled gently against the pale bed of her left ring finger. No blood, no pain, just the shimmer of something that did not belong there. At first, she tried to scrape it out with a needle. The sharp silver edge pierced the skin, drew a clean bead of red, but the thread remained. Deeper it pulsed. She pressed her hand to her chest, whispering a prayer her grandmother once stitched into her dresses. What is bound in thread cannot bleed unless cut. But the needle trembled in her hand. Lien told no one, not yet. The village had its own way of treating things it didn't understand, and she had seen what silence preserved and what fear destroyed. The wedding was hours away. Her bridal robe, hand-dyed the color of rice wine and sunset, waited on the cedar hanger. Her veil, pure as ghost silk, hung beside it. Outside, the gongs would soon begin. The village girls were already gathering flowers. The matchmaker would come to check her hair. The old women would come to see if she wept for sorrow or for joy. But none of them would check beneath her fingernails. She stared at it again, the thread. Was it moving? She blinked. It pulsed once, just once, like it had responded. Her grandmother, Ba Ko, had once been the village weaver. Mute from birth, she'd spoken only in the language of cloth. Every table runner, curtain, and shroud bore her touch. Every pattern was a poem if you knew how to read it. After Ba Ko passed 3 years ago, Yen inherited her house, her loom, and the thick silence that lived in both. That morning, Yen went into the weaving room instead of the bridal chamber. The room still smelled of jasmine ash and moth oil. Her fingers found the old chest where her grandmother's tools were stored. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. Maybe another needle, maybe an answer. Instead, she found a sealed bundle of red fabric, coarse, older than dust, bound in twine, embroidered with a single stitched character. Yuan, fate. Inside, there was no robe, no veil, only remnants, shredded cloth, threads cut short, bits of hair still tangled in the knots, and a name, sewn in pale thread across a torn hem. My Lin. Not hers. Not anyone she knew. Lien felt the thread beneath her fingernail twitch. She dropped the bundle. It landed with a sound too soft to make noise, and yet the air changed, the shadows thickened, the candle on the shelf hissed without wind. She picked it up again, this time slowly. At the very bottom of the bundle, there was a folded piece of rice paper tucked between the threads. Her grandmother's handwriting was unmistakable, sharp and thin like reed grass in winter. The thread does not choose love, it chooses remembrance. What is bound must one day return, or it will pull until it breaks. Lien traced the final character. It was signed not with a name, but with a stitched symbol, a closed eye. The needle slipped from her hand and rolled across the floor. It didn't stop at the base of the loom, it kept going, as if drawn. She followed. There, in the dim crack between the floorboards, something glinted. She pried them up with the same old needle. And there, nestled beneath wood and dust and decades, was a spool. Red thread, the exact shade as the one under her nail, wrapped tight, endless, unbroken. She stared at it, and it stared back, not with eyes, no, but with memory, with weight, with intention. The morning passed without time. She did not dress, she did not weep. She sat in front of the old bone-handled loom with the spool clutched in one hand and the note in the other, listening to the whisper of wind that sounded too much like breath. When they came knocking, the matchmaker, the girls, the mother-in-law-to-be, Lien did not answer. They called her name. They whispered of bad luck. They knocked again. She said nothing. The spool in her hand pulsed like a second heart, and beneath her nail the thread had spread. Now it touched every finger. Thin lines of red across her pale skin, as if sewn delicately from inside. She did not cry. She reached for the loom and began to weave. Not a veil, not a dress, but something else. Something the thread remembered. Something that would remember her. The village called her the weaver's daughter, even long after the loom had fallen silent. They did not say her name unless they had to. It carried something heavy, something woven into their own fear. To them, Lien was not simply a girl. She was a pattern repeating itself, the unfinished stitch of a lineage that refused to die. When she walked through the morning market, people parted like mist around a tomb, not out of cruelty, out of habit. They remembered her grandmother. They remembered what happened to the thread. That evening, the air tasted of rain and iron. Lien sat beside the loom again, its wooden frame glistening faintly in the lamplight. The spool of red thread lay before her, quiet now, or pretending to be. She lifted it gently. It was warm, too warm. Her mind drifted back to the only story her grandmother ever told her, not through words, but through the rhythm of the shuttle and the breath between beats. Bako had once made a wedding veil for a woman from the river village, white silk stitched with crimson thread. The bride wanted luck, wanted love, wanted to ensure her husband would never stray. When the veil was finished, Bako found her fingertips bleeding and the spool of red nearly gone. 3 nights later, the groom was found hanging from the rafters of their home, his mouth stuffed with wedding silk, his eyes sewn shut with the same crimson thread. The villagers whispered. They said Bako had stitched a curse into the cloth, but she never defended herself. She simply burned the loom, then built another, and kept weaving. Lien remembered the sound of that new loom, its voice, its heartbeat. The clack of the shuttle and the hum of thread sliding through the wood were the only language her grandmother ever needed. Each night the old woman wove stories no one dared to interpret. Lien had grown up beside it, lulled to sleep by its pulse. Sometimes she thought she heard voices in the rhythm, not the weavers, but those caught within the weave. A whisper, a breath, a sigh stitched between every thread. Now, years later, the loom stood before her again, whole, waiting. The note she'd found still trembled in her lap. The thread does not choose love, it chooses remembrance. She mouthed the words. The red line beneath her nail pulsed faintly, as if acknowledging her. Remembrance, she whispered. Remembrance of what? The lamp flickered, and she was no longer alone. The room darkened, though the flame did not die. Shadows gathered where they shouldn't, in corners where nothing stood. And from the farthest wall, a faint figure took shape. Her grandmother. Bent spine, bare feet, the faint outline of hair tied in a long white knot. No eyes, only hollows where light should live. Lien didn't scream. The air was too heavy for that. She only whispered, "Bako." The figure raised a hand, slow, trembling, and pointed toward the loom. She followed her gaze. On the floorboards lay a small wooden box she'd never seen before, wrapped in faded rice paper and sealed with red wax. Her grandmother's ghost vanished as soon as her eyes met it. The air went still, then cold. Lien knelt and broke the seal. Inside was a journal, not written in ink, but embroidered. Thread stitched directly into the paper, each line a strand of crimson silk, each letter formed by needle and blood. Lien turned the first page. The first entry was dated 50 years ago. The red thread was not made by hands. It was found tangled in the roots of the banyan tree behind the temple, soaked with tears. I thought it was silk. I thought it was holy. I was wrong. The next entry read, "Each time I use it, the loom hums louder. It remembers, and I forget." Lien's breath hitched. Her hands trembled. The thread beneath her nails tightened as if reacting to her heartbeat. She turned the next page, slower now. It cannot be cut. It can only be passed down. Every daughter must carry what the mother could not finish. This is the law of the crimson thread. She stared at the words until they blurred. Her throat felt raw, her chest heavy. She wanted to stop reading, but the needle that had rolled earlier began to move on its own, tapping against the next page like a command. Lien obeyed. The final entry was dated the night her grandmother died. The thread grows restless. It whispers for a name I do not know. If it finds her, she will not escape it. When the moon bleeds, tell her not to weave. Her pulse slowed, her vision dimmed. Then faintly, a voice. It wasn't in her head, it came from the loom. A whisper, thin as breath, soft as silk sliding through teeth. "You've already begun, child." The lamp hissed. The red thread from the spool began to unspool itself on its own, slowly, deliberately, wrapping around the loom's pegs, through the shuttle, over the frame. It moved like a living thing, guided by invisible fingers. Lien's hand reached out, against her will. The thread coiled around her palm and sank into her skin. Pain bloomed, not sharp, but ancient, a memory being remembered through her. In that moment, she saw the river, the banyan tree, women in white standing beneath it, their mouths sewn shut, hands tying red threads between their wrists, their throats, their hearts, and in the center, the weaver, her grandmother, cutting one strand too soon. Lien gasped. The vision vanished. The thread went still. The lamp sputtered and went out. Darkness fell. The only light came from beneath her skin, the faint red glow tracing her veins like veins of embered silk. She heard her grandmother's voice one last time, faint, breaking like wind through a torn cloth. Zwin không đứt được đâu con à. The bond cannot be broken, child. Lien sat motionless beside the loom until dawn. When the first light touched the window, the red thread curled around the shuttle, perfectly woven. A veil, but not for her. It was too small, too familiar. She lifted it and saw that the initials embroidered in the hem were not hers. They belonged to the dead bride from the story, Mai Ling. And as the sunlight reached her, she realized the veil smelled faintly of river water, old, cold, and still weeping. They said he came from the river bend, where the fog never lifted and the roads forgot their names. Dewey arrived in Tam Log just before dusk on the 3rd day of the 7th lunar month, a time the elders warned was cursed with thin veils and wandering souls. But no one stopped him. No one ever stopped the one chosen by the thread. He came alone, with no ox, no cart, only a bamboo satchel and a shadow that stretched too long behind him. Lien watched him from behind the bamboo curtain of her weaving room. The crimson veil lay folded in her lap, still warm from her touch. As he stepped across the threshold of her grandmother's gate, the red thread beneath her nails shivered. Dewey was not a man born of laughter or boasting. He spoke little, moved like a thought just outside reach, and his eyes, dark, unreadable, carried a weight that seemed stitched into his bones. Lien had only met him once before, briefly, 2 years ago. Their marriage had been arranged by the village matchmaker, negotiated through families who believed in omens more than affections. But in that first meeting, he'd said something she never forgot. "I do not come for love. I come because it calls." At the time, she thought it strange. Now she understood. He greeted her with a bow, not too low, not too warm, as if bowing to something behind her. They sat beneath the old camphor tree, where the wind sounded like breathing through cloth. He reached into his satchel and removed something wrapped in black silk. A spool, red thread, the exact shade as hers. He placed it between them without a word. Lien did not touch it. She only stared. "I found it tangled in my mother's comb," he said, finally. She'd kept it locked in a lacquer box, claimed it saved her once, from heartbreak or from memory. She never said. Lien looked up. And where is she now? Dewey's gaze dropped to the earth. She wove it into a cradle, he said quietly, for my sister. The silence that followed was deep enough to drown in. And your sister? Lien asked. He met her eyes. Vanished. That night, as Dewey slept in the guest room Ba Ko once used to dry funeral cloths, Lien sat by the loom and wept without tears. She held both spools, hers and his, and watched as the threads leaned toward one another without touching. There was something in that distance, a tension, a recognition. Two threads, same blood, same curse. Dewey had brought more than a spool. He had brought echoes. In the days that followed, Dewey began to help around the house. He repaired the wooden eaves, swept the ash from the old hearth, and burned incense each dusk before the shrine. But never did he touch the loom. Lien noticed that he carried a red scar across his wrist. Not fresh, not deep, but deliberate. The kind of scar made not by accident, but by cutting something that shouldn't be cut. She asked once. He did not answer. Later, she found a small bundle tucked into the folds of his travel cloak. Inside, a locket, made of lacquered bone, carved with two letters, V.L., Van Lin, his sister. And behind the locket, a scrap of parchment, one line written in faded ink, "If you find her, do not let her speak." On the 7th day of his stay, Dewey followed Lien into the weaving room. The loom sat untouched, but the thread had multiplied. It crawled along the beams, across the window frame, down into the cracks of the floor like vines made from memory. "Your house remembers," Dewey said. Nodded. "So does yours." He reached into his cloak again and produced a needle, long, silver, and old. "Yours?" she asked. He shook his head. "It belonged to the woman who taught my mother. They called her the Moon Threader. She weaved names into silence, and once she sewed her own mouth shut to keep a secret." Lien looked at the needle, then at him. "What secret?" Dewey's voice dropped to a whisper. "Love is the most dangerous thread of all, because once it binds you, it doesn't let go, even in death." That night, Lien dreamed. She stood in the river, its water like glass. Dewey stood on the far bank, calling her, but she could not move. Threads coiled around her ankles, her arms, her mouth. The water darkened, and from the depths rose a woman in bridal white, her veil soaked, her hair floating like black ink. Van Lin. Her eyes were hollow, and her wrists were tied with red thread, the same that now bound Lien's own hands. As the river filled her lungs, Lien heard Dewey cry out, but she could not answer, because the thread had woven itself into her throat. She woke gasping, her sheets damp with cold sweat. The thread beneath her fingernails had spread again, now tracing up her wrist, winding toward her shoulder. She ran to the mirror. Her reflection blinked slower than she did, and in the reflection, behind her, stood Van Lin, soaked, silent, sewing her lips together with the silver needle. When she turned, the room was empty, but the veil on the loom had grown longer, and embroidered at its hem was a new line of text, "You are not the first." The next morning, Lien asked Dewey to take her to his family shrine. He refused at first, said the road was dangerous, that the villagers of the river bend no longer walked it. But she insisted, and so just past sunrise, they crossed the old bridge where the river turned silver with fog and entered the place where his blood began. What they found at the shrine made her breath stop. 7 veils, all crimson, all draped across the stones like skin left behind, and beneath each veil was a name carved, 1 per generation. Lien recognized some of them, but it was the last one that made her hand tremble. Nguyen Lien, her name, already etched, already waiting.
The veil hung from the loom like a living thing, breathing softly, swaying though there was no wind. By the 4th day after visiting Dewey's family shrine, Lien began to notice something impossible. Each morning, the veil grew longer. Its edge shimmered faintly, as though new stitches had appeared overnight. She had stopped weaving, but the veil had not stopped becoming. At first, she thought she was imagining it, that her mind, exhausted by grief and memory, was playing tricks on her. But on the 7th dawn, she awoke to find her pillow damp, stained with small, perfect dots of blood. Not hers. The blood had soaked through the cloth in a pattern, fine looping threads winding into the shape of a name. Von Ling. The letter shimmered wetly before fading into the fabric. Yen touched her fingertip to the stain. It pulsed once, like the throb of a heartbeat still clinging to the world. That was when she realized the thread was feeding. The spool never emptied. The cloth never tore. Yet her fingertips remained raw, her nails cracked, her skin marked by faint red lines that deepened each time she approached the loom. She tried to bandage her hands, but the bandages unwound themselves by morning, each strip of white now laced with a thin line of red, as if the thread refused to be forgotten. She prayed to her ancestors. She burned incense. She whispered the chant her grandmother once hummed before every weave. A thread for love, a thread for loss, a thread that binds what cannot cross. But even her prayers came out in rhythm, a weaver's rhythm, the pattern of something older than faith. That night, she found Dewey outside, kneeling before the small shrine in the courtyard. Candles flickered weakly in the wind. He was whispering names, not to her, but to the air. The same names carved into the stones beneath the river shrine. She heard him pause between each one, as though listening for a response. When she stepped closer, she noticed his fingers were bleeding too. A thin cut ran along the base of each one, the same place the thread had touched her. "Who you calling to?" she asked softly. He didn't look up. "The ones who came before us," he said. "The ones the thread remembers." He finally turned to her, and she saw it, a faint line of red circling her neck, almost invisible in the candlelight. "What is that?" she whispered. Dewey reached up, touched his throat. "I dreamed of her, my sister, Von Ling." She spoke without opening her mouth. Her lips were sewn, but her voice still came through. "What did she say?" He swallowed. "That the veil isn't for us, it's for the one waiting at the river's mouth." Lien's skin went cold. "Who?" Dewey looked toward the forest. "The weaver, the first." That night, Lien tried to burn the veil. She waited until the moon rose high, swollen and red like a drop of blood caught in glass. She carried the veil outside, laid it on the wet earth, and struck a match. The flame trembled, then died. No smoke, no ash. The cloth refused to burn. She tried again. The flame flared, only to vanish as soon as it touched the fabric. And then the veil bled. A single drop rolled down the hem, dark and thick, staining the soil. From somewhere behind her, she heard the faint sound of weaving, the steady rhythm of shuttle against loom. But when she turned, the loom was still inside the house, untouched. The sound was coming from beneath the ground. The next morning, Yen woke up to find her hands moving on their own. Her body sat at the loom. Her mind felt distant, adrift, as though she were watching through fog. The shuttle glided back and forth, pulling the thread taut, her fingers bleeding but unflinching. Each thread hummed faintly, a note, a whisper, a voice. She realized the veil was no longer a single piece of cloth. It was a tapestry. Faces, dozens of them, all women. Some she recognized, the ancestors whose portraits hung on her family altar. Others were strangers, women with stitched mouths, hollow eyes, and long, dripping hair. And in the center, a space left blank, the shape of a woman not yet woven. Her own. Dewey found her hours later, still weaving, her lips moving soundlessly. He shook her shoulders. She blinked, dazed, as if waking from a dream. The loom stopped. The red thread trailed from her fingers to the spool, unbroken. And then they both heard it. The faintest cry. It came from inside the cloth. Yen reached out. The veil trembled. Then, impossibly, it exhaled, a soft, shuddering sigh, as though someone buried within it had just taken a breath after years of drowning. Dewey grabbed her wrist. "Don't touch it!" But the veil had already begun to move. The thread shifted like veins pulsing under skin, tightening around the wooden frame. And from within the pattern of woven faces, one began to open her eyes. Van Ling. The loom creaked. The air grew thick, humming with something electric, something alive. Yen's voice broke into a whisper. "She's inside." Dewey stepped back, his expression unreadable, caught between horror and guilt. "She's always been inside," he said softly. "The thread doesn't take the dead, it takes the living who won't let go." Yen felt her throat tighten. "You knew." He looked at her, eyes wet, haunted. "I tried to cut it. You saw what it did." He raised his hand to his neck, tracing the faint scar. "I thought if I bled enough, it would end with me. But the thread, it chooses who remembers." Silence fell. The only sound was the steady, gentle pulse of the loom, the heartbeat of the thread itself. Yen turned to the tapestry. The faces had gone still again, but their eyes followed her, even when she looked away. "Then who's the blank space for?" she asked. Dewey didn't answer. He didn't have to. The thread beneath her fingernails began to move again, curling up her wrists, wrapping around her arms like a lover's embrace. And for the first time, she understood what her grandmother's final note meant. The thread does not choose love, it chooses remembrance. Her love had remembered too deeply, and now it was time to pay. That night, the villagers said they heard the sound of weaving long after midnight. When they woke, they found red fibers trailing through the streets, from Yen's window, down the path, into the river. The next morning, Yen's house was empty. Only the loom remained, still warm, still humming softly. And on the unfinished tapestry, the final space was no longer blank. It bore the outline of a woman in white, her face stitched delicately, her eyes closed, her lips curved faintly, as though smiling in sleep. The house was quiet, too quiet.
When Du returned the next morning, the front door stood ajar. The incense he had lit the night before had burned to ash, leaving only a faint coil of smoke that curled like a question mark in the air. And the loom was still humming, softly, as if mourning. He called Leon's name, once, then again. No answer, only silence, and the steady ticking of the shuttle, moving on its own, back and forth, guided by hands no longer present. The tapestry had grown longer, much longer. It now spilled onto the floor, across the room and out the door, threads crawling over the stone like veins trying to remember where the heart had gone. Du didn't touch it. He stepped carefully around the blood-colored cloth, following the trail of red thread that slithered out the back of the house, past the old rain barrels, into the garden that had been left unwatered for weeks. There, beneath the family shrine, he saw it, a small crack in the stone foundation. And from that crack, the thread disappeared into the dark. He should have turned back. But grief is its own kind of thread. It pulls, even when you know it's tightening around your throat. He knelt before the stone and brushed aside the moss. His fingers found an indentation, a hidden latch, old and rusted. He pressed. The earth gave a sigh, a soft click, and then a door. It opened with a groan that sounded like breath caught between teeth. Stairs descended into the dark, carved roughly from stone and packed earth. The air that rose from the gap was thick with age. It smelled of incense, bone, and salt, and something older than death. He lit a lantern. The thread guided him down, brushing against his ankles like a cat remembering its master. The steps led to a low chamber carved beneath the house, a forgotten womb of silence. And at the center of that chamber, rising from the dirt floor like the skeleton of a god, was a loom, but not of wood, not of cedar or bamboo like Leon's. No, this one was made of bone. Long femurs shaped the frame, finger bones linked the gears. The shuttle was a carved jawbone, still bearing teeth, and the threads wrapped through it were not dyed. They were red because they were raw. Du dropped to his knees. He had seen shrines before. He had seen altars and relics, but this was not built to honor. This was built to bind. There were markings along the bone, etchings in old script, Norm and something even older, maybe Tom, the lost language of forest monks. He couldn't read them, but he felt them. They pulsed with memory. He moved closer. Behind the bone loom, nestled in a hollow dug into the clay wall, lay a small bundle wrapped in bridal cloth. He reached for it. The red thread coiled tighter around his wrist. It resisted, but not enough to stop him. He pulled the bundle into the light and unwrapped it slowly. Inside were three things: a lock of long black hair bound with thread, a piece of fingernail stained with blood, and a heart, shriveled, dried, still pierced by a bone needle. Du gasped. He stumbled back, nearly dropping the lantern. The shadows around him stirred, curling upward like smoke rising from forgotten incense. And then he saw them. Faces, dozens of them, pressed into the earthen walls, stitched shut with thread, eyes wide, mouths silent. They were not corpses. They were remnants, echoes of women taken by the loom, their grief imprinted like fingerprints in clay. And among them, near the base, he saw one face he knew, Leon, not dead, not yet, but fading. Her eyes met his, not in flesh, but in shape, in shadow, in stitch. Her lips moved once, and though no sound came, he understood. It's not too late. He turned back to the bone loom. It was moving now, not by gears, not by hands, but by memory. The thread looped and twisted on its own, sewing not cloth, but fate. Each pass of the shuttle whispered a name. Each knot tightened around a soul. And Do realized the truth. The crimson thread was never meant for love. It was never a blessing. It was a contract, signed in blood, bound by memory, paid through generations. The loom below the house was the first, the mother loom, and Leon, she was its next sacrifice. He reached into his satchel, pulled out the silver needle, the one gifted by his mother, the one once used by the moon threader. He whispered the old incantation, "Cut not the thread, but offer it breath. Let the bound remember, let the forgotten speak." The bone loom hissed, the thread recoiled. He approached with the needle, holding it out like a blade. The faces in the wall began to move, their mouths opened, and from the cracks came the sound of wind through teeth, hundreds of voices, whispering in unison, "Unravel us." Do plunged the needle into the heart. The red thread snapped, not entirely, but enough to shudder. The bone loom groaned. The gears ground to a halt, and the faces, the women trapped in memory, began to dissolve into ash, one by one, weeping silently. Do's face was the last to fade. She smiled, then was gone. Above him, in the house, the shuttle stopped. He climbed the stairs. The thread no longer crawled along the floor. The loom sat quiet. The tapestry had vanished. Only one spool remained on the loom's side table. Red, yes, but now brittle, dry, as though emptied of spirit. He picked it up. It crumbled in his hand. He wept, not from sorrow, but from release. For the first time in generations, the thread had loosened. But he knew better to call it over. The crimson thread never ends. It only retreats, waits, remembers. That night, Do packed his things and left Tamla. The house remained behind, empty now, except for the loom. And beneath the floorboards, the faint sound of breathing in the clay. Long before Lien, long before Dui, long before the first stitch was ever drawn from blood, there was a girl. Her name was Tu Ha, and she was the first to break the thread. The story was not written in books. It was kept in hushed lullabies, unfinished altar prayers, and the stitched hems of mourning garments that no one dared to wear twice. But deep beneath the house, in the chamber Dui had opened, something had remembered her. And now her memory stirred like dust in a coffin being opened. Dui did not sleep after leaving Tamla. He wandered through forests once sacred, past banyan trees that leaned with crooked backs, whispering as he passed. The red thread was gone from his skin, but he still felt it, a tightness in his chest, a ghost pull in his veins. Each night he dreamed the same dream, a girl standing at a riverside altar, barefoot, veil torn, eyes swollen with grief. In her hands a red thread. At her feet a boy's body wrapped in white linen. The dream never changed until the 7th night. That night the boy opened his eyes and whispered her name. Dwi awoke before dawn. The air was cold, the sky bruised. He stood at the edge of a moss-covered shrine hidden deep in the northern forest, a place no longer marked on maps, and carved into the stone, nearly erased by time. Ha of the unbound vow. Inside, incense crumbled into silence. Dust painted every surface like forgotten snowfall. But at the center of the shrine stood a statue, a woman in flowing robes, mouth closed, eyes downcast, and between her fingers a single thread carved from red jade. He knelt before it, whispered the prayer his mother had taught him, and the air changed. Time shifted, and the shrine remembered. The vision came not with sound, but with thread. It wove itself before his eyes, flickering scenes, old and soft as decayed silk. He saw her, Du-Ha, the girl from his dreams. She was the daughter of a cloth priestess, raised beside the river, taught to spin stories into thread, to bless unions by weaving the names of lovers into their wedding garments. But she fell in love with a boy beneath her station, a poor boatman who ferried pilgrims and monks across the river, Tien. Their love was not permitted. Her mother forbade it. The ancestors turned cold. But love, like thread, tightens when pulled. And so they made a vow, not with rings, but with a stitch. One thread, 2 wrists, 1 promise, bind us beyond death. It was sacred. It was forbidden. It was broken. A war came. The boatman was conscripted. Ha waited for weeks, then months. One night she had a vision, his boat adrift, empty, stained red. Her grief became madness. She returned to the altar where they had first tied the thread, and she tried to cut it. But thread forged in love and sealed by breath does not snap like string. When she forced the blade through it, the thread bled, and the ground beneath the altar cracked. The thread had been bound to memory, not just hers, but to every woman born from her blood. In choosing to unbind, she cursed the line. From then on, every daughter born of Du-Ha's blood would bear the thread, not at birth, but at the moment of choosing. The moment love entered their hearts, the red thread would awaken beneath their skin, whispering, pulling, tightening. And if they dared love wrongly, or too deeply, or not enough, the loom would remember, and the bone beneath the house would begin to hum. Dwi staggered back from the vision. His mouth was dry. His hands ached. On his palms, faint lines had appeared, as though invisible needles had sewn across them in his sleep. Not deep, not painful, but present, like a warning. He sat before the statue again and looked at the red jade thread clutched in its stone fingers. "How do I end it?" he whispered. No voice answered. But a breeze swept through the shrine, despite there being no door, no window. And something fluttered from the base of the statue. A piece of old silk, fragile, stained with age. He opened it slowly. On it were embroidered words in thread that shimmered silver in the dawn light. To end what was broken, it must be finished, not undone, but completed.
Dwi frowned. What must be finished? As he spoke, the final line appeared, the thread stitching itself before his eyes. The wedding that never was. He remembered the tapestry, the veil, the blank space at its center. Lien had not disappeared. She had been taken into the cloth. Because the thread did not desire death, it wanted memory restored. It wanted the vow fulfilled. And so to stop the thread, they must do what Tuha never did. Not run from the vow, not cut it, but complete it. The realization struck Dwi like a wound. He had not lost Lien to death. He had lost her to unfinished love. The crimson thread was never a curse of pain, not at first. It had been sacred, but it had turned bitter through generations of broken promises and silenced women. Now it hungered not for blood, but for closure. Dwi stood, the silk still in his hands. The wind whispered through the trees. In the breeze he heard a voice, soft, fragile and trembling. I remember you. It was Lien, faint, distant, calling through the thread. Not gone, not yet. He knew what he had to do. Not burn the tapestry, not bury the loom, but find her within the weave and give the vow what it wanted. A wedding, a remembrance, a thread not severed, but tied properly, finally, forever.
The road to Tamla had changed. It was no longer the path Dewey remembered. The trees leaned closer now. The sky was always dusk, and the red thread curled along the trail like veins pulsing beneath skin. It no longer hid. It welcomed him, guided him, tugged at the corners of his memory like a bride drawing a veil across her face. He returned to the house just before twilight. The date stood open, draped in faded white ribbons, torn, fluttering, frayed by wind that didn't blow. The house itself looked abandoned, but not untouched. It bore the marks of ritual. Chalk lines, ash circles, a single bridal slipper left on the steps. And hanging above the door, tied in a knot that resembled a noose, a veil. Hers. Inside, silence hummed. The loom was quiet. But on the far wall, where once there had been bare wood and a window to the garden, there now hung something vast. The tapestry. Fully woven, covering the entire wall, pulsing faintly with life. Dewey approached slowly. Each step echoed like footsteps in a temple. He reached out, and the cloth breathed. The thread responded to his skin. And then from the center of the tapestry, the veil parted. Behind it was not a wall. It was a corridor. Dark, narrow, woven entirely from thread. Red, ivory, shadow. A hallway of cloth. He stepped inside. The thread wrapped around his wrist, not to bind, but to lead. He followed. Inside the tapestry, the world was different. The floor was soft, like walking on woven moss. The air was warm, still, unmoving. Sound was muffled, like he was underwater or dreaming. Portraits stitched from memory lined the fabric walls. Faces both familiar and forgotten. All women, all veiled, all watching. He passed through archways sewn from prayer knots, bridges made of bridal belts, chambers shaped like ribs and stitched with oaths. And then he heard music, a single instrument, a dantreng, its strings plucked by invisible fingers. The melody slow, mournful,
endless. It guided him to a grand chamber, circular, vast, built entirely from veils. And in the center, an altar. White stone, red thread coiled across its surface like roots. At the altar stood Lien, or something that looked like her. She wore her wedding robe, hair pinned with silver combs, hands folded in front of her chest, palms up, like a bride waiting to receive the vow. Her eyes were open, but empty. Not blank, not dead, just paused, like memory held in stillness. "Lien," Dewey whispered. She didn't move. The veil over her face shimmered faintly, as if reacting to his voice. He stepped closer, but the altar groaned, and from the shadowed corners of the chamber they emerged. Brides. Dozens. Hundreds. Their faces stitched shut, their gowns frayed with age, their feet silent on the thread-woven floor. And when they opened their mouths, the stitches remained, but their voices poured out anyway, woven into the air like threads of sound. "He has returned. He has remembered. The vow is not broken. It is waiting." Dewey trembled. He looked back at Lien. Her hands had risen, slowly, trembling to remove her veil. But the thread resisted. It clung to her skin. Then, softly, a voice, hers but not hers, whispered from behind the veil. "I can't move. The ceremony began without you. It won't end until you finish it." He stepped forward. The altar pulsed. The red thread on its surface rose, coiling into the shape of two wrists bound together. An offering, a contract, a final chance. Dewey knelt, took Lien's hands in his. They were cold, but still hers. He reached into his cloak and retrieved the silver needle, the one given to him by his mother, the one once used to weave love into breath. He held it to her palm. The brides in the circle leaned forward as one. The air tightened. The loom, though not seen, began to hum again, slow and low, like thunder stitched into silk. Dewey whispered, "I offer my thread, not to bind you, but to join you." And he pricked his palm. Blood rose. Then he guided her hand. Together they sewed one stitch from his skin to hers, and in that moment the veil lifted. Her eyes cleared. Color returned to her face. The thread beneath her skin shimmered and then unraveled, dissolving into light. Around them the brides began to disappear, not vanishing, but dissolving into peace. Their candles dimmed, their stitches unraveled, and their voices softened. The wedding is complete. The tapestry behind them folded in on itself, thread by thread. The corridor collapsed, the chamber dimmed, the altar faded. And when Dewey and Lien opened their eyes again, they were standing in the weaving room. The loom was silent, the spool empty, and the house, finally, quiet. Outside, the morning light broke clean across the sky. A bird sang. A breeze moved through the open door. Dewey looked at Lien. She looked back. There were no more threads beneath their nails, no more faces in the cloth, only breath, only now, only memory, whole, not haunting. But just before they stepped outside, Lien turned back. On the loom's frame, carved so faintly it might have gone unseen, a message, stitched into the wood grain. Those who complete the vow need not weave again, but those who forget The thread remembers.
The thread was gone, but the quiet remained. Too quiet. The kind that settles not on the skin, but deep in the bones, like old cloth wrapped too tightly around the soul. For 3 days the house stood still. The loom no longer hummed. The red thread had turned to dust, its spool empty and brittle. Even the walls, once etched with unseen eyes, had faded into wood and silence. Lien tried to rest. She folded the veil and placed it beneath the family altar. She cleaned the floors, repainted the gate, tended the garden. But something lingered. Not in the loom, not in the air, in her dreams. Every night the same vision, a field of graves, all unmarked, all silent, and one, at the very center, pulsing softly beneath the earth, as if someone beneath still breathed through layers of silk and soil. Each time she approached it, she woke gasping, her hands clenched, her throat dry, her chest tight with invisible thread. On the 4th morning, she returned to the family shrine. It sat behind the house, shaded by the old camphor tree, a place of incense and offerings, a place of names carved into wood. Her grandmother's tablet was there, Ba Ko, the weaver. Lien knelt, lit 3 sticks of incense, but the flame refused to catch, not from wind, from resistance, as though the smoke itself no longer wished to rise. She struck the match again, still nothing. And then she noticed the base of the altar, where soil met stone, had cracked, just slightly, but enough. Red thread poked through. She stepped back, her heart slowed, the breeze stilled. She knelt again, brushing away the dirt with trembling fingers. The thread was real, tangible, coiled like a worm just beneath the surface. And it wasn't frayed. It was tied, knotted, thick, old, but taut with something that still pulled from below. Lien swallowed and began to dig. The soil gave way too easily, as if it had been waiting. Beneath the surface, the roots were dry, the stones brittle. The deeper she went, the more she found strands of red, looping through the earth like veins in a corpse. She dug until her fingers bled, and then her hand hit wood. The coffin, her grandmother's. The lid bore no nails, only thread, wrapped again and again around its edges, sealed not with hammer or metal, but with crimson silk that pulsed faintly in the light. Lien choked on breath. This wasn't burial. It was containment. She reached for her knife, but something stopped her. A memory. Her grandmother's hands, always sewing, always silent. The way she stitched her warnings into hems. The way she touched Lien's face before dying, fingers trembling, like she wanted to say something, but had run out of thread. Lien pressed her palm to the coffin lid. It was warm. She whispered, "Ba Ko." The soil shifted, just slightly, and the thread pulled tighter. Lien took the knife and cut it. The air split, the earth sighed, the thread uncoiled like a scream unraveling from the past. The lid opened, not with a creak, but with silence so loud it rang inside her ears. Inside, her grandmother lay intact, eyes closed, hands folded over her chest, but her lips
were sewn shut. Not by decay, by choice, stitched with red thread, tiny, perfect, deliberate. And not just the lips, her eyes, her wrists, her chest, every seam of her body sealed by crimson. She had buried herself, bound. Liane staggered back. In the folds of her grandmother's robe, something shifted. A note, stitched into the lining. She reached in, pulled. It unraveled like a confession. Words embroidered in trembling script. If you are reading this, I failed. I sewed myself shut so I could not speak her name, so she could not come through me. But memory, it leaks. Liane's hands trembled. The note continued. The thread did not begin with me, but I was the first to give it voice. I thought I could bind it. Instead, I fed it. Tears welled in Liane's eyes. The note continued. It asked for daughters. It asked for vows, but what it truly wanted was to be remembered. And at the bottom, do not burn me. Do not bury me again. Weave me. Finish what I started. Let her rest. No signature. Only a final stitched symbol. A closed eye, now weeping. Liane sat beside the grave until nightfall. She did not move. She did not cry. She only stared at her grandmother's body, at the quiet defiance in her sewn lips, at the thread that had bound not only fate, but silence. The vow might have been completed, but the debt was deeper. An entire generation of women had been stitched shut, their voices replaced by cloth, their choices sealed in soil. The crimson thread wasn't just a curse, it was a history, one that had to be spoken. That night, Liane brought her grandmother's body inside. She cleaned her hands, unraveled the threads from her wrists, her eyes, her lips. She laid her gently before the loom, not to weave her into memory, but to give her a voice, one final time. Liane picked up the needle and began. Not a tapestry, not a veil, but a scroll. Each stitch a sentence, each thread a truth, each knot a name long buried. She wove not to bind, but to release. By dawn, the cloth hung across the wall, red, white, silver, gray. A history sewn from silence, a story unstitched from blood. And at the very bottom, a single thread looped into a new shape, a resting eye, open. Finally,
It began with the thread. Always, it begins with the thread. But this time, it didn't come from the loom. It came from the window. The first night, Liane heard the creak of the shutter just after midnight. She rose from the pallet, candle in hand, and tiptoed to the wall. The wind was still. The trees didn't move, but the wooden frame moaned softly, not from weather, but from weight. She pushed open the curtain and saw her. A girl, no older than 16, hair black and damp like riverweed, pale hands held at her sides, limp, her body still, but her mouth moving, silently, mouthing something again and again. Liane opened the window. There was no breath, no sound, only the motion of lips forming one word: undo. Then the girl raised her hand and pulled a thread from her own wrist.
Lean stumbled back. The thread was red, wet. She watched as the girl placed it gently on the sill, folding it like an offering. Then she turned and vanished into the night without a sound. The next morning, the thread remained, thin, slick, slightly warm. It didn't move, didn't pulse, didn't hum, just waited. Lean wrapped it in cloth and placed it in a jar beside the altar. She said nothing to Du Yu. Some things, even now, felt too delicate to speak aloud. The second night, the girl returned. Same time, same window, same silence. But this time, she stepped closer, not onto the sill, but into the room. Her feet made no sound. Her eyes remained hidden beneath her long black bangs. And again, her lips moved. Undo. She pulled another thread, this time from beneath her eye. It slid like a tear. She laid it on Lean's pillow, then turned and vanished once more. This time, Lean followed. She ran barefoot through the yard across the grass, but by the time she reached the gate, the girl was gone. Only a faint trail of thread remained on the path, curling into the dirt, then disappearing. That night, Lean couldn't sleep. She unwrapped both threads, held them in her palm. One was smooth, the other frayed. Both were bleeding faintly, not with fresh blood, but with something older, a kind of grief, a kind of silence made visible. By the third night, she was waiting. She left the window open, lit 3 candles, and placed a needle beside the sill. The girl came, but this time, she was not alone. Dozens of threads stretched behind her, trailing from her hair, her arms, her mouth. Each one thin as breath, each one trembling. She stepped through the window again, slower this time, and for the first time, Lean saw her face. Or rather, the absence of it. There were no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just blank, stitched skin, drawn tight like a shroud. But still, the lips moved beneath it. Still the word came, undo. The girl stepped to the wall, lifted her hand, and began sewing. With no needle, no thread, just her fingers moving in the air. And as they moved, marks appeared, stitches. Along the walls, across the ceiling, on the floorboards beneath Lean's feet, all forming the same pattern. A braid, a knot, a circle, and in the center, one word, name. Lean spoke for the first time. What name? The girl turned to her, and from behind the stitched skin, her voice came, not through lips, but through the room. The one the thread won't remember, the one the loom erased, the first. Lean's breath caught. Tu-ha? The girl blinked slowly, and the stitches across her face tightened, then tore. Not with violence, but like paper soaked in water, quietly falling apart. And from behind them, she smiled. In that smile, Lean saw it. This was not just a ghost. This was the forgotten memory of Tu-Ha's daughter, the child that was never named, the one conceived before the vow, the one erased when the thread demanded silence. She had not died. She had been unmade. Her name never spoken, her story never told. Not even her mother remembered, because the thread only preserved what it bound. Everything else it consumed. The girl stepped back and pointed to the tapestry on the far wall, the one Lean had woven from her grandmother's truth. At the bottom corner, where the cloth touched the floor, a tear had appeared, just a single perfect rip. And from within that rip, red thread leaked slowly, like blood from a wound too long hidden. The girl whispered one final time, "Undo," then vanished. Lean stared at the rip, then at the wall. She lit more candles, tied her hair back, took up her needle, and unstitched it. The cloth came apart like skin, the thread unraveled like breath, and beneath the final layer she found it. A single name, written in childlike script, embroidered not with red, but with white. Clean, simple. Knock. The daughter who never lived, the one forgotten by both vow and blood. The one the loom feared because her birth was not bound by the thread. She was the only one free, and that freedom had been buried until now. Lean wept, not from fear, but from remembrance. She stitched the name into a new cloth, folded it gently, placed it on the altar, and whispered, "You are remembered." Outside, the wind shifted, the camphor tree swayed, and at the window, the girl smiled, then vanished. That night, no thread appeared, no whispers came, no lips moved in silence, only sleep, deep, dreamless, still.
Lynn did not wake in her bed. She woke in cloth. Warm, damp, close. The kind of closeness that is not comfort, but confinement. She could not move her arms, could not stretch her legs. Her face was pressed against a woven surface that pulsed faintly with warmth, as if it had just been lifted from a body. And surrounding her, silence. Not the silence of peace, but of waiting. She tried to cry out, her voice caught in her throat, not by force, but by thread. A single strand rested across her lips like a finger made of memory. She blinked. The cloth above her blinked back. It took a full breath for her to understand. She was wrapped in a tapestry, not laid beneath it, not covered, but inside it, cocooned. And the fabric was not blank. It was full, each inch stitched with eyes, open, staring, hundreds of them, thread-stitched, some blinking, some weeping, some closed, only to open when her gaze found them. Each one watched her with the same expression, recognition. She struggled. The fabric flexed, not to resist, but to respond. It shifted like skin, pressing back with the weight of memory. Lynn whispered, "Let me out." The eyes blinked in unison, and the cloth whispered back,
Not yet. You must see. The fabric began to move, not roll, not stretch, unfold. Lynn felt herself rising, not physically, but through layers of story. Each fold peeled back a life. Each layer was a memory not her own, and yet deeply familiar. She was not moving upward, she was moving deeper. She passed through the first layer, a girl kneeling before a river shrine, face covered in ash, sewing a name into her own tongue to keep from speaking it aloud. She passed through another, a bride on her wedding night, hands bound by red thread, whispering to a mirror as her reflection sewed without her. And another, a mother, holding her newborn, only to find a thread already tied around its wrist, not placed by hand, but borne that way. Each memory pulled her downward. Each stitch in the cloth was not thread, but a woman. Lynn understood. She was wrapped in the stories of the forgotten. Not the cursed, not the wicked, the remembered but unnamed. Those who had lived, loved, lost, and been sewn away. At the center, she came to the seam. It was different from the others. No faces, no names, only a great knot, messy, tangled, bleeding slowly. It pulsed like a wound that would not close. From it came the faint sound of crying. Lynn pressed her hand to it. The thread peeled back, and she saw herself, not as she was now, as she was before the thread, before the loom, before Dwi. A little girl sitting on her grandmother's lap, watching the shuttle move back and forth. The child reached out, not to touch the loom, but to touch Bako's face. Lynn remembered this, but now she saw what she'd missed. Her grandmother crying, silently, as she wove, tears stitched directly into the cloth, hidden in the hem of a table runner, in the fold of a curtain. Bako had wept for all of them, and had no one to tell, except the loom. The tapestry shifted again. Lynn passed through more layers, each one looser, more frayed. She saw the weavers who came before even Bako, a girl who stitched prayer flags with her own hair, a woman who embroidered her unborn daughter's name into the lining of her funeral dress, a seamstress who bled into every thread and smiled because it was the only way her children would remember her. And then, the final layer, the empty space, a part of the tapestry untouched. No stitches, no names, only soft, waiting cloth. She knew what it was. It was her place, the spot the loom had prepared. The thread wanted her there, wanted her woven in, bound forever, as memory, not person. She hovered in that empty silence, then whispered, "No." The cloth trembled. "You must take your place." "No," she said again, louder. "You are next. I am not yours." The fabric tightened, not angrily, but desperately, as if afraid. The eyes from the stitched eyes began to murmur, "Stay, stay, stay." She raised her hand and made the motion of cutting. The cloth shrieked, not aloud, but within, a sound like threads tearing from memory, like names unspoken for too long being ripped from silence. The eyes wept, the cloth bled, the world began to unravel. When she opened her eyes, she was lying on the floor of the weaving room, wrapped in a single piece of cloth, old, gray, threadbare. It fell apart in her hands like ash and scattered to the wind. She stood. The loom was still, the altar quiet, the air light. For the first time since the vow, she felt herself. No thread beneath her nails, no name tugging at her ribs, only breath, only choice. She walked outside. Dawn was rising, and on the doorstep lay something new. A spool, but not of red, not of black, of white, soft, clean, unmarked. No thread of fate, just thread, waiting to be used for whatever came next.
The forest beyond Tom-La had no name. It was never marked on maps. It was the place villagers did not speak of, even when their eyes turned toward it. To some, it was just trees. To others, a place of forgetting. But to Len, it was where the threads crossed. She entered at dawn. No path, no trail, just mist and roots and silence so thick it muffled even her breath. The white spool sat in her satchel, untouched. Not a tool, a question. What would she make now that the red thread was gone? She walked for hours, or minutes. Time did not behave here. Light fell through the trees like it didn't belong, scattering in broken pieces across the moss. And everywhere, threads, hanging like vines, red, white, gold, black. Some broken, some tangled, some still reaching for hands that would never return. They floated in the air like spirits. She passed beneath them with reverence. One brushed her cheek. It felt like breath. By midday, or perhaps just before, she found the first one. A man kneeling beside a tree, hands clasped like prayer. His eyes were open, but he didn't see her. A red thread stretched from his heart to a branch above, frayed, quivering. It pulsed faintly like it remembered being alive. She stepped close. He didn't move, only whispered. She promised to come back, so I stayed. Len touched the thread. It snapped, gently, and the man sighed, then faded, not like death, but like dust finding the wind. Further in she found more. A girl dancing in circles, a spool dragging behind her like a leash, a pair of lovers frozen in an embrace that had become ritual, not affection. An old woman sitting in a chair of vines, stitching names into a scarf so long it wrapped the entire clearing. Each of them tethered, each of them waiting, each of them unfinished. Len began to see what the loom had never shown her, that the thread was not evil, it was lost. Each person caught in its web had chosen, at some point, to bind themselves out of love or guilt or grief. The thread only held on because they did, and some did not know how to let go. She passed beneath a willow where golden thread hung like rain. There a woman turned toward her. Half her face was gone, not from violence, but from fading. Only the stitched side remained. She didn't speak. She only reached out and placed something in her hand. A thimble, carved from bone. Inside, a single strand of red thread. The last one. Not a curse, a memory. Len nodded in silence. She placed the thimble in her pouch and kept walking. At the forest's center, the threads grew dense. They hung like stars from every tree, each one a story, each one a heartbeat still echoing in silence. And there, in the clearing, She saw them, the ones who had never been maimed. Women, girls, mothers, daughters, sisters. They stood side by side, veiled in translucent cloth, stitched with questions. Not curses, not vengeance, just the same plea whispered again and again. Remember me, please, even if it hurts. Len stood before them. She removed the white spool from her pouch, held it high, and said, I will not bind you, I will not bury you, but I will weave you, one by one, not into silence, but into song. The wind shifted. The threads around her danced. One by one, the veiled women stepped forward. Each placed a stitch on the spool. Not red, not white, a color somewhere between, like dusk or the moment before a tear falls. And then they bowed and walked into the trees, unbound. Len sat in the clearing until night fell. She did not weave, not yet. She held the spool in her hands, felt its weight. It was not heavy, but it was full. Full of names, full of stories, full of things too long kept in shadow. And she knew now what her grandmother had truly meant. To remember is to weave, but to love is to choose what not to sew shut. She stood. The forest whispered around her, and she whispered back, I will carry you. When she left the forest, morning had not yet begun, but light had returned, and behind her, the threads faded one by one, not erased, but folded into peace. The house was waiting for her. It no longer creaked, no longer hummed, no longer whispered from the corners. It had become quiet, not with stillness, but with anticipation. As though it knew, tonight something would end or begin again. Lien stepped inside. The white spool from the forest was in her hand. It shimmered faintly now, not with color, but with something deeper. Memory. Not inherited, not passed down, but chosen. The sun had set behind the hills, and in the center of the loom room, the loom sat uncovered. She had not seen it in days, but it had changed. The frame was no longer cedar. It was bone, not the brittle, decaying kind, but ivory smooth, polished with reverence. And around it, thread hung in the air like spider silk, suspended in impossible stillness. A cloth waited on the loom's beam, blank, infinite, untouched. And behind it, someone stood. He wore no face, no eyes, no mouth, only a long veil made from every color the eye could not name. Hands like root and flame moved through the thread, never touching, only guiding. The Crimson Weaver, the one the ancestors whispered about, the god never named in prayer, not because he was forbidden, but because he was owed. Lien did not bow. She stepped forward and spoke softly. You remember me. The weaver's head tilted, a slow nod through silence. You remember all of them. Another nod. She placed the white spool on the floor before him. I have carried them, she said. The daughters, the veiled, the ones you left waiting. The weaver reached out, a hand of pure thread and ash, and lifted the spool. He held it for a long time, then wove a single strand into the loom. The cloth shimmered, and a figure began to appear. Dewy.
His face, his smile, his breath caught mid-laugh, his eyes looking toward her, not at her, but into her. Lien stepped closer. Tears burned her throat. He was not a memory. He was becoming. And then, the cloth split. Two paths unraveled. One stitched in silver thread, soft and light. The other red, deep, pulsing, wet. The weaver raised both hands. No words, only the thread. Two choices. The silver path. Dewey would return, breathe, speak, hold her again. Their lives could begin where they once frayed. But it would cost. The thread would be fed. Another would be taken, not today, not soon, but someday. Someone down the line, because the loom always remembers its bargain. The red path. The thread would be cut, the debt forgiven. No more weaving, no more memory, peace. But Dewey would vanish, not to death, to unbeing, forgotten by the thread, by time, by Lien herself, as if he had never existed. The weaver waited. Lien stepped forward. She looked into the cloth. Dewey's image flickered, warm, full of breath, almost smiling. She could feel the weight of his hand in hers again, the mornings they never got to have, the stories they would never finish. She whispered, "You would be worth the price." The thread stirred. The silver path brightened. But then, from the back of the room, a whisper. "Lien." She turned. No one there. But the voice, it was Nyok, the forgotten daughter, the one buried in the tapestry, the one who had smiled from the window with no mouth. Another whisper. "If you weave him, you weave another girl like me." Lien trembled. The thread in her palm grew warm. Her heart pulsed once, twice, then steadied. She turned back to the weaver, held out her hand, and took the red thread. She placed it across the cloth and pulled. Cut. The loom shuddered. The cloth burst into threads of light. Dewey's image flickered, smiled, and then exhaled. He faded like morning mist, and with him, the weight lifted. No pain, no scream, just release. The weaver bowed once, then vanished. The loom collapsed into dust, and the house exhaled, the soft breath of generations unspooling into peace. Lien sat alone, the white spool still warm in her lap. Not empty, not full, just waiting. And for the first time, she understood. The thread had never been the curse. The choice was. Now, the choice was hers. She stood, walked to the window. The wind moved through the trees like fingers brushing a forgotten braid. And far in the distance, in the forest beyond, she heard something soft. Not a whisper, not a song, but a heartbeat. Her own, finally, unthreaded.
Lien did not return to the loom. There was no loom anymore. Only ash, only silence. But the thread remained.
Not red, not cursed. White, soft, waiting. She had carried it from the forest, carried it through the wedding that never ended, carried it through the altar, the shadow of Dewey, the god of thread and dust. Now she carried it for herself. She sat on the floor where the loom had once stood, laid out the white spool, and breathed. No chants, no rituals, no ancestral prayers, only memory and the sound of her own heart. She threaded her needle and began to stitch. Not a veil, not a tapestry, a knot. One thread looped again and again, folded, twisted, woven through itself. No image, no pattern, only a knot that held what was lost, held what was chosen, held the weight of love that had nowhere else to go. She stitched for hours, each motion slow, meditative, each pull of the thread carrying Dewey's name, not to summon him, but to honor him. The knot grew, not large, but heavy. Heavy with meaning, heavy with every breath they never shared, every word left unsaid, every morning they'd never wake into. And when the final loop was pulled, the thread stopped. Lien tied it shut. No bow, no flourish, just a simple, perfect knot. She placed it on the altar, lit 3 candles, bowed her head, and whispered, "You were loved. That is enough." That night, the house did not whisper. The trees did not move. The thread did not stir. But as Lien lay in bed, eyes closed, hands resting on her chest, she felt it. The weight beside her. Not heavy, just familiar. A presence like heat. A presence like breath. She opened her eyes. He stood at the doorway. Not Dewey, not quite, but something of him. His shadow, his shape. His eyes, soft, unsure, held the same grief she did. He did not speak. He simply nodded and reached out, not to touch her, but to touch the knot. She held it out with both hands. He placed his hand above it, and together they pressed it to the floor. The thread pulsed once, then unraveled not into cloth, into light. The room shimmered. The air thickened with the scent of jasmine, firewood, and tears. And then he was gone. Not vanished, not torn away, just finished. In the silence that followed, the floor was bare. The knot was gone. Only the candlelight flickered. Only her breath remained. But she was not hollow. She was full. Not of thread, not of fate, but of peace. In the morning, she hung a cloth above the door. Plain white, hand-woven, unadorned. When villagers passed by, they asked what it meant. She smiled and said, "It's a thread for what I no longer carry." They nodded,
not understanding, but some wept anyway. The house remained quiet in the weeks that followed, but now when the wind passed through the windows, it no longer sounded like weaving, it sounded like singing. And on the altar, in place of the knot, a single final stitch appeared one morning. No one had sewn it, but it was there. In white thread, delicate and still. Thank you.
Dawn came like breath. Not loud, not grand, just the faint hush of light kissing the edge of the trees. It did not announce itself. It simply arrived. Lien stood at the threshold of her home. No longer a weaver, no longer a bride, no longer a name carried by the thread. She held nothing but a single object in her hands, a veil, white, untouched by red. No name sewn into its hem, no vows stitched between its folds, only a whisper of cloth, light enough to forget, strong enough to remember. She had made it last night, one final weave, not for the dead, not for the ancestors, not for Dewey, for herself. No loom, just her hands, the white thread, and the silence between stitches. Each movement slow, each knot a breath. She did not cry, not because there was no grief left, but because the grief had found its form, and it no longer needed tears. Now she walked, past the altar, past the garden, past the gate no longer marked by ritual or watchfulness. The forest waited, not with fear, with acceptance. The trees opened to her, the mist parted, the path revealed itself, not because it had been made, but because she had earned it. She carried the veil folded in her arms. It did not flutter, it did not bleed, it simply was. She passed through the clearing where the forgotten once waited, empty now. Only birdsong, only branches, only the echo of laughter that had never been loud enough to haunt. Farther in, the roots rose like ribs, the soil softened, and then the clearing, the place where the first thread was whispered into earth. There was no altar, no stone, no monument, only an ancient tree with bark like wrinkled skin, its trunk cracked down the center like a wound that had once split the world in two. Lien stepped forward, kneeled, unfolded the veil, held it in her lap. She closed her eyes and said, without voice, "This is where I leave it." The wind responded, not with words, but with release. Soft, warm, like hands letting go of rope. The branches above her swayed, the roots below exhaled, and the veil lifted. It rose from her lap like breath escaping a body, hovered, shimmered. Then, caught by the wind, it drifted upward, 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 until it vanished into the canopy. Gone, not fallen, not claimed, released. Lien did not reach for it. She only smiled, faint and quiet, and stood. When she turned, the forest had changed. The trees were farther apart, the light clearer, and the air smelled not of soil or thread or incense, but of possibility. She walked, not to return, but to continue. And behind her, the tree, the roots, the forest, forgot. Not out of cruelty, but out of kindness. Some stories deserve rest, even the ones whispered beside a loom. In the village, children still played with thread, still tied knots for luck, still asked their elders about the red string that once danced between fated lovers' fingers. But the answers came softer now, no longer fear, only folklore, only myth, only stories stitched with quiet hands into silence. And somewhere, in a place no longer marked by thread or time, Leanne knelt by a riverside, her hair loose, her fingers empty, her eyes open. She watched the water move. It did not bind. It did not bleed. It only flowed. And as the first light of morning kissed her skin, she smiled. The thread did not end. It simply stopped pulling.